In this Northern Brewer video, we get pro tips on yeast strain selection from an expert in the field, Lance Shaner of Omega Yeast Labs. Lance discusses at length how understanding the vital stats of different yeast strains will guide your decision on choosing the right one for your homebrew recipes. Plus, some inspirational thoughts on pushing the boundaries of yeast as brewers continue to explore this all-important beer-making ingredient. This video is actually a lesson excerpt from our full Northern Brewer University online course on yeast. In this video class, we look at the different kinds of yeast available to homebrewers, both dry and liquid, how they are produced, what factors in the brewing process affect their performance, and what things you can do to increase yeast health during fermentation. To learn more about our long format video course and to register, see the link in the video description below or visit northernbrewer.com/university.
My name is Lance Shaner. I'm the co-owner and co-founder of Omega Yeast in Chicago. I kind of oversee our production operations and research and development efforts. And Northern Brewer has asked me to talk about yeast choice and maybe some of the parameters you use to choose a yeast when you're developing your own recipe. Certainly if you're following a recipe in a book or a magazine, it's not a bad idea to use the strain that is recommended of you. But if you're starting to explore your own recipes, then I'm going to maybe give you some tips on how to read info on a yeast strain and help you choose the right yeast strain, and maybe even think outside the box a little bit and not be so shoehorned into picking a particular yeast for a style. So I think the first thing to think about when you're choosing a strain is what style are you making? So for example, if you're going to make an English ale or one of the varieties of English ales, do you have to use an English ale strain? It's certainly not a bad thing to do so. That's where those strains came from, so you can do that. But there are other strains that you could use, for example, to make those beers. American ale strains, especially since most of them have evolved from English ale strains, are also appropriate to make those strains or to make those beer styles. And really what you're wanting to think about in that case is esters. A lot of English strains are very estery, which are the compounds that smell kind of fruity. And English beers are known for having a lot of ester content. So that would be one thing. But if you're wanting to put the focus more on the malt, then it's not unreasonable to use an American ale strain like the Chico strain, what we call West Coast Ale 1. It's very neutral and it's going to let the malt and the hops speak. It's still going to make a completely appropriate English ale strain. So one of the points I'd like to get across is really to not be too honed in on the strain's name. If in the name it has its kind of geographical origin, don't assume that it's only used for those styles. And a great example of that is our British 5. That strain is used dominantly in the United States to make hazy IPAs, which is a quintessentially American style, something invented here. So, but that strain works better than any others. And it has a lot to do with the ester profile it has that fits into that style nicely, but it's also incredibly haze inducing. So you end up with a lot of haze when you're combining it with dry hopping. And again, that's an English ale strain. If you tried to make a hazy IPA with Chico, you don't necessarily get that kind of enduring haze. That's something that yeast brings to the table. So now let's think about the characteristics that you might see on a pack of yeast. I'm going to start with phenolics. So what a phenolic is essentially the spicy aroma that you get from a lot of Belgian yeast. It smells like cloves in some cases. And yeast has a natural ability to release what's a compound called 4-VG from ferulic acid, which is naturally present in malt. And so a phenolic strain can take that ferulic acid, convert it to 4-VG, and that's how we smell cloves and spices. And this is something that you expect in a lot of Belgian ales. But a lot of other strains have a natural mutation in that gene. So they still have that gene, but it's basically broken. So they're no longer making this enzyme that can convert ferulic acid to 4-VG. And that's the case in American ale strains, English ale strains, Kveik, lager yeasts. They all have a mutation in that gene. So they have the gene, but it's broken, and that's why we don't smell cloves in there. But again, the natural state of yeast is to be able to do that conversion, which is, I think, an interesting scientific tidbit. But it's something you need to keep in mind when you're choosing a yeast to make a beer. You would not choose a phenolic strain if you're trying to make an American-style IPA or an English ale, because that phenolic flavor and aroma is considered an off flavor in those styles, and it's really going to make it taste contaminated because it's not something you're used to in that style. So definitely be mindful of whether the beer you're brewing is phenolic or not when you're choosing a strain. So another parameter that we consider when we're choosing a yeast is flocculation, and really what that means is the ability of yeast to stick to itself when fermentation is complete. So a highly flocculent strain, at the end of fermentation, when all the sugars are gone, will just kind of stick to all of its partners in the neighborhood. And when they do that, they form these big clumps that helps them drop out of the beer faster. And this is something you see in a lot of English ale strains. And historically, it's been kind of a useful thing for brewers because it makes them easier to harvest, because those yeast quickly drop out of the beer, and you now have clear beer that you can rack off and send to another vessel. But it's something you want to consider and just be tracking when you're following your beer's progress. A highly flocculent strain is going to drop out and make clearer beer faster, and you may have to wait longer for a beer for a yeast that has very low flocculation. Just as an example, like French Saison is very, very low flocking yeast. It's going to take a while till you get clear beer because that yeast doesn't stick to each other and drop out. So you really kind of have to wait for the yeast for gravity to take over and for it to drop out. So it's something you want to consider maybe when if you have a deadline, if you're making a beer for an event and you need to turn it around quickly. It's probably not a good idea to choose a non-flocculent yeast because you're going to have to wait on that. And with a highly flocculent strain, you're going to be able to turn that beer around a little faster, and it's going to be more presentable more quickly. So flocculation is not necessarily related to haze. So there are certain beer styles these days where a lot of haze is desirable, like any IPA. And a lot of brewers, I think, assume that you want a low flocculation strain when you're making a hazy IPA. And we've done a lot of research in this area, and that is really not the case. Haze and flocculation are largely unrelated. Certainly, low flocking yeast can create haze, but once that yeast drops out, it's no longer hazy. This is in contrast to like the British Ale 5 strain, which is used to make hazy IPAs. It's actually a very flocculent strain. So, but it produces an extremely hazy beer, and these are really kind of unrelated. The yeast is doing something else when it's in conjunction with dry hopping that creates this really stable haze that sticks around, but it is not the yeast in suspension. In contrast, there are other styles like German Hefeweizen, for example, where that haze is quite literally caused by the yeast. And there are actually examples of the way they'll serve these beers is turn the keg, store it upside down, and when they're ready to serve it, turn the keg over. The yeast will kind of drop out, get up in the beer, and now you've got haze from that yeast. So in that case, that is caused by the yeast, but that's a very specific style. By and large, haze and flocculation are unrelated. So you could actually look at our website. We've shared some of this information on haze, and long term we will be putting out more of this information for brewers, and it'll probably at some point be a parameter that we put on our packs, is whether a strain is haze positive or not. Because again, this is really not related to flocculation, and we want to make people aware that when they're choosing yeast for their hazification ability, that you aren't basing it on their flocculation. So attenuation is another term that you're going to see on yeast, and what that is referring to is really the amount of sugar in a recipe that a yeast is consuming. And certain yeasts are able to consume more sugar than others. So if you want a dry beer, one that doesn't have much residual sweetness, that's the sort of parameter you're going to want to look at. And some kind of more extreme examples would be like the French Saison strain, which is extremely attenuative. And the way it achieves that is it makes this enzyme that it sends outside the cell, and this enzyme can take dextrins that are left over by most other yeasts and chop those dextrins up into glucose molecules, which the cell can now take up and ferment. So the result is that you get extremely high attenuation. So it's not unreasonable to see 90 to 100% apparent attenuation. This yeast is able to consume and attenuate all of the sugar that's available to it. On the other end of the spectrum, there are British yeasts that have low attenuation, where and they use those to make styles where a little bit of residual sweetness is desired and expected. And really, it's just because these yeasts can't use all the sugars that are there. Maltodextrose, for example, is a type of sugar that some yeasts can't utilize efficiently. It's just 3 glucose molecules attached to each other. Yeast, for some reason, can't take them up and ferment them. So that leaves it behind in the wort and in the beer and gives you a little more residual sweetness, which again is desirable in some cases and not in others. But it's something you need to be mindful of. So the best way to do that is to check strains attenuation. And it's usually going to be expressed as a percentage and with a range. And it's important to note that this is, based on fermenting a kind of a standardized wort. It's not to say that you can't exceed those numbers or not meet those numbers, because a lot of that is going to depend on the process you used. If you do a very, very high mash temperature that results in a lot of, long dextrins left over, that is going to end up you're going to end up with less attenuation. Even if a strain is, like West Coast 1 has a fairly high attenuation, you can get under that level based on how you set up your brew parameters. So these are not hard and fast, I'm always going to end up in that range. It just gives you an idea of the attenuation levels relative to other yeast strains, I think, is the best way to look at it. So it gives you a relative measurement between yeast strains, but not an absolute for what that strain is always going to do. Another characteristic on yeast packs to be aware of is alcohol tolerance. And much like attenuation, it's a range or kind of a soft point. It's not hard and fast. It doesn't mean that you're always going to be able to achieve that. It depends a lot on yeast health. But again, if you look at these numbers in terms of relative ability between strains, it can help steer you towards a strain that has high alcohol tolerance when you need it. It's also not unusual for strains to be able to go beyond the stated alcohol tolerance. It has a lot to do, again, with how your wort is prepared, how much simple sugars you have. Did you add a bunch of corn sugar to it to increase fermentability? That can help you achieve higher ABV targets. So there are a lot of factors that go into how much alcohol you can get out of a yeast. But again, look at these packs in terms of relative between yeast strains. This strain is showing a higher alcohol tolerance than this one. And you want high ABV, choose the one that has a relatively higher alcohol tolerance. So when you think about it, beer is pretty complex. I mean, there was only 4 main ingredients, but all of those ingredients play off one another to give you your final result. And yeast is going to respond differently in these different environments. So I think one of the important tips too is to just read the description that a lab has for its yeast. And that'll give you an idea of kind of its ester output. In other words, how fruity it is or how neutral it is. And think about that in terms of your recipe goals. If you're trying to brew an American-style blonde ale where you want very, very little yeast character, look for a strain that's described as being neutral and not putting out a lot of flavor. So like the Chico strain is very, very good there. On the other hand, if you want a simple beer, but you want some focus on some fruity esters, you can make that beer with an English ale strain and get some of those nice fruity qualities that you get from an English ale strain. Or you can turn that same recipe into a Belgian pale ale by using a Belgian strain, which is now going to, usually phenolic, and it's going to put out some of these spicy clove aromatics that will completely change what you get out of that beer. Use a Saison strain, again, in that same recipe, and now you have a Saison. It's going to be highly attenuated, dry, aromatic, clovey, all based on that yeast selection. So a few notes on lager yeast. So lager yeasts are the natural hybridization of an ale strain and a different Saccharomyces species. And the unique thing about them, as compared to ale strains, is they are cold tolerant. So they ferment at pretty cold temperatures and usually yield a very clean, low ester type of beer. But they really kind of arose around 500, 600 years ago. So they really haven't had as much time to evolve down their own paths like ale strains have. So we have a tremendous variety in what ale strains do. There's a little bit less of that with lager yeast. By and large, I think you can really be more adventurous with subbing lager strains in certain recipes because the differences aren't necessarily as significant as they are with ale yeast. There's certainly some differences in flocculation and attenuation, things like that, so you can get drier results with certain ones. But by and large, they're intended to be very neutral. Make a German-style fest beer with Mexican lager. It's going to make a really, really great beer. There's just a lot of flexibility within lager yeast, despite what you might see with the name on the pack. So historically, we've used lager yeast at cold temperatures. That's because they are very tolerant to these cold temperatures, but they are perfectly happy at warmer temperatures. You're not going to get a bad beer if you use a lager yeast at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, for example. It might be slightly fruitier than it would be if you fermented it at 50, but it's still going to make a very drinkable and pleasant beer. It's not going to turn into all of a sudden, a phenolic, weird beer. They like these warmer temperatures. They'll still make good beer. Just maybe, expect a little different in the ester quality. So since we founded Omega Yeast now almost 10 years ago, right from the start, we wanted to push the boundaries of yeast. Because really up until then, it was about making historical strains that brewers have used for centuries, available to brewers in a pure and reliable form. But we want to do more than that. We do that too, but we want to create new strains, and we've used several methods to do that. So we have hybrids, which is actually physically mating different strains to create new strains. An example of that is our Sazenstein's Monster. And we've also used modern technology, including CRISPR, to nudge certain characteristics. An example of that is our thiolized yeast strains. So we've given those strains the ability to attack precursor forms of thiols and make beers that give you really out of this world tropical aromas that weren't available to brewers before. And that is what gets me up in the morning. That's what makes me excited to go to work, is creating new tools for brewers and then putting those out in the world and seeing what they do with them. We certainly brew with these ourselves and have some ideas on what they could be used for, but when we get them out in the world, we learn things about them because brewers are just naturally adventurous. So it's fun to just hand these tools over to brewers and see what they can do with them and use them to help push brewing into new directions and make flavors that people want in new ways. So consider your goals and read all the information on a yeast pack, but don't be beholden to where the strain comes from. Just think about it more as what your recipe goals are, how the yeast strain is described, and use the strain that you think is going to get you the results you're after.